Welcome, everybody. Al Hewer here. In addition to being Terry's partner in A&T lectures, I'm a professor at Rutgers. I edit respiratory textbooks. I want to welcome you and thank you all for your wonderful service, whether it be in the front lines or in some sort of a support role in our COVID-19 response. And I also want to thank you for joining us today. If you're new to us, welcome. Glad that you're new. If you're returning back to us, thank you for that as well. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you get something out of these lectures. So A&T Lectures offers several, if you will, modules. 1 hour CEU modules that are online and in live. Okay, and they are pretty much evidence-based. I give one. Kenny Miller gives a couple. My partner Terry gives another as well. This particular one is not as evidence-based. This is really a reflection on, again, my experience and that of my colleagues being a frontliner during the initial surge and during the subsequent, I'm going to call it mini surge. I mean, no disrespect, but we had a blip up during the initial surge in the, I'm going to call it spring and early summer of 2020. We went up to as high as 99 COVID patient events. I know there's institutions that surpass that. So I'm aware that somewhere in the hundreds got that. We went up to 99. Last winter, late fall, winter, early spring, we went up to as high as about 18 or 19. Okay, it varied, a little bit. And it just never seemed to go above 20. We'll talk a little bit about that during this particular lecture, but the main thrust, if you will, of this presentation is to basically talk about a frontliner's view. To, if you will, preface that, we'll summarize some key milestones that occurred in the spring of 2020, and the surge that has extended on into 2021. A lot of the information that I'm going to be presenting is from I kept a journal during this time, and I kept the journal because it helped me at first. It just to kind of get it out, get it down on paper. I found that as I kept the journal after several months, it didn't help as much. And I found that I was having to relive, things. So I was more sporadic in keeping it. And I still occasionally will enter into it as well. But this is basically, it's not just from what I can remember. It's actually going back into my dear journal and kind of taking a lot of that and, putting it into a PowerPoint presentation. This is not refined. This is kind of a raw presentation, but it's really designed to share with you what many of you either experienced directly or had loved ones, friends, colleagues that also experienced. We'll look at critiquing, a little bit of critiquing. I'm not a Monday morning quarterback. I have succeeded at things. I have failed at things. Okay, but what I constantly am doing is reflecting on my actions, my behavior, whether it be in my relationship as a husband and a friend and a brother, and also my functioning as a lead therapist at a major, in the ICU of a major hospital in northern New Jersey. Okay, and constantly trying to be the best, the person, therapist, husband, friend that I can possibly be. So some of the critique that I share with you today is not to throw stones at my colleagues or anything like that. It is just to basically look back and say, things could have been done differently. What are some of those things? Review some of the lessons learned and furnish you with some additional resources for those of you that want to learn more about this very dynamic topic of COVID-19. Disclaimer, chronological summary of my experience and that of some of my colleagues in a COVID ICU. It was really multiple COVID ICUs, major medical center, mainly in the spring of 2020. But I talk about some of the things that have happened, including some fairly recent course of events as well. So the surge, so I have a couple of slides here really talking about the surge, through the last fall. But then on the right-hand side here, looking at, some of the more recent data, looking at 2021 through July. So the unfortunate reality is we had this spike, this re-spike, if you will, last winter. And now, certain areas are experiencing a spike. It's I don't mean weird, but I mean, New Jersey, we have about a 72, give or take, % vaccination rate of our population. It's fairly high relative to some other states. and I'm not picking on Florida, I'm not picking on Louisiana, but some other states have relatively low, less than half that. So they have rates of like 30, 32%. Okay. So it's really kind of a critical difference. It appears as though that the states that have these much lower vaccination rates are being affected more heavily by the most recent surge of COVID-19, the Delta variant of that virus. So the beginning for us was the end of February 2020. And, we had a patient who was on a non-rebreather and 60 liters a minute, high flow, so it was on 100% oxygen. You get the idea. And there were a 10-bed MICU. And the attending physician indicates, says to me, Dr. Sousa, great doctor, admire him tremendously, says, "Hey, Al, if this patient needs to be intubated, you and I are going to put on the moon suits and we're going to have to go in and do this." And I asked him, "Okay, I'll do the best I can, it's fine. Where are the moon suits?" And he looked at me, he said, didn't know what his moon suits were. There's nothing funny about this. When I laugh, it's like a nervous laugh. I just scratch my head thinking back on this stuff, Sometimes when I present on this, I've given this presentation a few times, I actually have like nightmares that night, but in any event. So this is more of a nervous laugh. Infection control nurse actually comes up to the unit and she wrote up another nurse for tying her gown in the front, her disposable gown in the front. She's supposed to tie in the back. Okay, gotcha. Okay, but rather than coaching us and saying, hey, just remember, she actually wrote them up. But I remember at the same time, we only had 2 N95s left in the unit. And I asked her, I said, "You're the infection control nurse." She goes, "Yeah, I am." She's all proud of herself. She's probably like, she probably barely knew what she didn't even know yet about this disease. And I said, "Well, if you're an infection control nurse, can you get us some more N95s? We only have 2 left. And I think we may be having to go into, a room and intubate a patient." And she looked like she was speechless. Okay. I don't want to say what she looked like, but it was just like she didn't know what to say. And she spun out of the unit very, very quickly. So, the critical issue, is not going to read this deep, but it was unexpected. It was unprecedented. A lot of us were doing just awkward stuff. When the first night I came back from taking care of being in the COVID unit, a week or 2 after this, I took the longest shower of my life and still felt like, did COVID get in my ears? And now I'm going to get, did it get in between my toes? Scrub, just crazy ass stuff that, we later knew that at least the initial variants, if you will, were not as contagious as we initially thought they were. Mid-March, and now we're projecting ahead, a few weeks. First 3 cases appear, 1 sent home from the ER, 2 were housed in the MICU, the MICU. My wife and I then split the house. Again, we have a bi-level, so we had a system where we did eat dinner together, but we were like, have these rich people, they eat like this dining room table, they eat on opposite ends of the table. We usually eat kind of next to each other or kind of catty corner of each other. But in order to maintain social distancing, I know we were on opposite ends of the table. I was joking, like we just need a candelabra and we need a butler serving us and be like rich people, whatever. But I was living downstairs. Thankfully we have 2 bathrooms, 1 up, 1 down. And she was, showering, sleeping, whatever. We did eat together, but pretty much we kept a relative distance. I had the system where I'd come in through the garage and go into the laundry room, which goes, which is a causeway in between the garage and, if you will, the downstairs. So I was that guy who was kind of, not running through the house, but running through the downstairs with take my clothes, my shoes off in the garage. Okay, didn't have any of that stuff in the house. I wanted to burn it, initially. So I was the guy running through the house with, butt ass naked because I didn't want to track COVID through the house. I know that a lot of you and your relatives, whatever, are doing a similar thing as well. Week of March 16th, cases went from I had to double check this. Cases went from 4,300 on March 16th to 64,000 in a day. Okay, a 15-folding. It was just absolutely, mind-boggling. Currently 2 intubated COVID patients in MICU. So we're still, we're getting the surge, but protocols for donning and doffing continue to change. It was what they changed also. Because of, if you didn't have, supposed to have this, but if they didn't have it, they'd be like, well, you can get by. They even had talk of like a bandana. I tried, so this 4th bullet under the 2nd major bullet, bandana chatter occurs. Leadership quoted, well, we have to resort to that. Are you out of your mind? bandana. What are we going to rob a bank? We're going to be like a bank robber. We're going to have a bandana, but it was just completely odd stuff, and you kind of, you just scratch your head and say, wait a minute, I'm the guy going in the room. Can somebody tell me, am I going to be safe going into that room? Because if I'm not, then, I'll take care of my business. I'll make sure my will is good. And, my wife knows, do not intubate me if I get COVID. She and my brother knows, do not. Do high flow. You can bring me to a place that does high flow. You can give me non-invasive. Don't. Critical issue, skyrocketing cases, lack of sound guidance. It was just, leadership was overwhelmed. We all were overwhelmed. Late March, some more resource limitations. The week of March 23rd, it's 12 bed, MIC was overflowing, 9 intubated patients. I remember one of the attending physicians was a 90-year-old demented COVID patient, intubated in the ER, was brought up and was terminally extubated 2 hours later. The attending physician he's normally a very even-keeled guy, was so angry that this wasn't done, that the conversation and dialogue, that this one-way extubation wasn't done, and that basically they hold the patient through the hospital. We set up a room, we did all this stuff, and then they said, you know what, we're gonna extubate the patient. N95 shortage still continues today. Duckbills are almost impossible to get, at least in my institution. N95 shortage means that you put your name on N95 and they autoclave it, and then they send it back and it's got your name on it. And okay. Mixed evidence on autoclaving N95. Okay. Funny thing is, I'm yet to see an administrator don an N95 in a hot zone, a reused one or a brand new one. Okay. Come to think of it, except for a chief medical officer, he's pretty much of I would classify him as a warrior, more on the warrior end of the spectrum. Okay. I remember there was one day when it was the day before Easter that year, where they must have told the administrators they need to come in the unit, and they looked so ski-botched. They looked like they came in like they wanted to be out of there so fast, and we're just going in and out of rooms, not indiscriminately, but we're like in rooms for a 12-hour shift. We're in rooms, I don't know, 7, 8 hours, something along those lines, but we're in rooms more than we weren't. We joke that the N95 becomes an N88. I'm being totally tongue-in-cheek, an N77 after several rounds of autoclaving. Oh, well, I think we can autoclave it 5 times. And then it was 10 times. And it was, we should only do it twice. Starts to break down after. And it's like, well, what is it? Which is it? It was just, crazy times. Late March, ICU is filling up. Fear factor starts weighing on all of us, me included, by the way. So NICU is now filled. So what you guys experience, we experience. So you start off with, you got a SICU and a MICU. So a surgical intensive care and a medical intensive, and then they start converting the pediatric intensive care unit becomes a COVID unit. Okay. And then the neuro intensive care becomes a COVID unit, and then. So you end up with these multiple units throughout the hospital, makeshift units that were stepped down, but they have piped in oxygen, they have this, they have that. It becomes a unit. 10 beds CCU, 10 beds CVICU. Also, were converted as other units were down the line. I remember, so March 26th, my thing, this is going to sound a little strange, but I kind of felt, still today in reflection, that probably the dirtiest thing on me, I would wear headgear. I would wear disposable headgear in addition to the PAPR, all that stuff, goggles, all of that. I felt that my socks were the dirtiest because we would put hot clogs on before we went into a hot room. But the socks, we didn't change those. The socks were worn all day, in and out of rooms, et cetera, et cetera. So I got into this habit. And so I'm a thief. Please don't rat me out. I would take, but I get to the hospital, I would put on patient socks, the disposable patient socks, wear them all day and throw them out, because I found that I was throwing out my own socks that were mine. And I said, well, so I would actually just take, come there, take my clean, both sneakers and socks off, put on hospital socks, put on my warm clogs. So they're technically clean, but they're hospital clogs. And then in the unit itself, and before we went to a patient's room, there were clogs that were there. But I just expressed, I said, the thing that I feel is dirtiest on me, aren't my hands, was the socks that were worn all day and warm in hot zones. Warm being you're in the hospital, it's a COVID hospital, hot being you're actually in patient rooms. March 27th, spoke to colleagues operating in other hospitals. So ARDSNet, about this, it seemed like it's work. They were using ARDSNet. So they're using these low tidal volumes, higher peeps. But what I was finding is they weren't saying anecdotally that they thought it was working. Proning was being done widespread, so it wasn't just in the in the press that you saw, etc. We were doing a lot of proning. HMEs, no heaters, really thinking that HMEs might get clogged up, but in some cases, the patients, COVID patients, did not have a lot of secretions. In other cases, they did. So in cases where they didn't have, or they had a lot of secretions, but they were starting to lighten up, we switched over to HMEs and just tried our best with that. Use of non-invasive and high flow nasal cannula was controversial, not just in the literature, because one of the other presentations I give really talks about non-invasive and high flow. That was controversial, but even within my organization, we had some hospitals that were using high flow and our hospital not. And I'm not saying that criticizing. Okay, what I'm saying is high reliability organizations do things, they have evidence-based protocols and do them consistently. We probably got a little off track with being highly reliable as an organization, not as a facility. On March 31st, my PAPR shut down at a patient's room. So it was like one of these things that PAPR has this kind of white noise sound. You got your hood on and they're battery powered. Okay. But by now we've been at this for a month. We're wiping down the PAPRs with bleach. The bleach was affecting the connections on the batteries and the female and the male connections. And we found that in some cases the batteries were charged, but it wasn't, the device, there's some issue with the battery powered. And it was like I realized that I'm saying the white noise is gone. I looked at it, my mask started to fog up, and then I said to myself, shit, my PAPR's not working. I need to get out of here soon. So I didn't run out of the room. Thankfully, we used these air evacuators that were actually creating negative pressure rooms that otherwise were not designed to be negative pressure. They actually would put different windows in that had if you will, a ductwork that was sucking out. And I was not on that side of the bed. I was in between the patient and the doorway, not in between the patient and the evacuator. Okay, so it shut down. I doffed probably as quickly as I ever did, but quickly but safely. And that was that type of deal. P.S. I had my PAPR shut down 2 other times, and I've had some colleagues have them shut down as well. 2 intubations, or assisted with 2 intubations. We do intubations at the hospital I work at, but we didn't do COVIDs, okay? What we ended up doing now is if a COVID codes, we can do the intubation, but if it's an elective one, get anesthesia to actually do it. And again, 2 intubations. The first 2 that I assisted, the airway looked really swollen and nasty. Glottis was, barely visible. And the anesthesiologists were scared shitless. We were all kind of scared shitless, to be honest with you. At 63 years old, I've learned to admit, it didn't stop me from going in rooms like my esteemed colleagues, my nursing and respiratory therapy colleagues were in the rooms a lot. God bless them. Never felt closer to some of my colleagues than I have since COVID. NJSRC, that's the New Jersey Society of Respiratory Care, sends a letter to the New Jersey Licensing Board recommending against placing multiple patients on a single ventilator. Okay. In some of our other related lectures, we actually talk about that as well. It's more of a theoretical thing. It technically can be done, but it's not something that we actively recommend it against. I got on this kick where watching the news, I saw Dr. So-and-so, nurse so-and-so, great job, wonderful job. And I'm saying to myself, man, respiratory therapists are in the room as much or more than anybody. Okay, now if we have nurses in the audience out there, that's fine. We're in the room a lot together. Okay, let's just say that. But I was like, the RTs aren't really they're really not getting notoriety. Not me, but the RTs. Then I started hearing it a little bit, but I was trying like holy heck, contacting news agencies, sending emails, calling, things like that. And I got to tell you, maybe they were just saturated. Maybe you needed to have a hook. You needed to know somebody in high places in order to have your story told, type of deal. But you know what? We tried. I have no regrets about trying. It was a little bit frustrating, but it wasn't about that. And eventually, honestly, even Sanjay Gupta on CNN, he actually mentioned respiratory therapists a few times. So it was kind of a good thing to hear. I think our profession of respiratory therapy ended up getting some pretty good press, but it wasn't nearly what some of the other professions got. April 3rd, terminally weaned. So check this out. April 3rd, our policy at the time was you could get exceptions to allow a wife or a husband to come in if the patient looked like they were dying or they had just died. So it was decided that, this wife comes in, she spoke with a Eastern European accent. just can't remember her name. I wouldn't share it if I could, but I don't remember her name. But we were using a servo eye ventilator, and we had the monitor outside the room. The vent was obviously in the room, and there was some issue with the cord being stretched too far. And before, I'm listening to this alarm go off. So I go, I put on my PAPR, I go in the patient's room, and it's alarming. And it was, what happened was the cable connection where it goes in the back of the vent, it had bent. It was still in, but it was bent. So the vent was alarming, basically saying my interface between the monitor and the vent it's there, but it's not functioning properly. So I had to extubate this patient, and the wife was present with PPE on, remove life support, and this damn vent wouldn't stop alarming, and there was nothing I could do short of hitting it with a hammer. There was nothing I could do to shut that alarm off. So the patient's wife had to endure the last minutes of her dying husband with this annoying alarm going on. It was just one of those things, many of you probably experienced it, where you were in a patient's room. It wasn't like, oh, I gotta change a filter, let me run out and get it. No, when you were in a patient's room, one of my biggest fears wasn't contracting the disease. I didn't want to get it. So let me say that was a fear, but it wasn't my biggest fear. Was having a problem in a patient's room and not having the supplies or equipment to fix it. And not being able to just jet out the room, wash your hands up, but you just couldn't do that. You just couldn't, we weren't nimble, So one of the things that was probably most beneficial is we started to have these runners. When you went in a room, you had somebody outside the room where it could be done, but a lot of times you did, who their job was to help you don and doff, but also give you what you needed. They were in a warm zone without cross-contaminating, in any manner. One of the hardest things was most people, in fact, even though this particular one had his wife present, most people with COVID died alone. They died with us. So we were the last people, the doctor, the nurse, the RT, maybe a combination of us, were the last people that this patient's present felt. Is just, and we were like strangers to them. It was just, where does that happen with such frequency? It was crazy. Some of our other presentations we talk about that, but pretty convinced that a lot of us that were in the front line were forever altered in many ways. Some recommendations are strictly theoretical. So again, multiple patients on event. COVID surge, not time for theory. It's happening too fast. Let's not theorize. April 7th, NICU, severe PAPR shortage, plenty of donated foods. We had a lot of Crocs. I don't know where these, the Crocs and shoes. We had plenty of Crocs. I think I have a couple pairs of Crocs that just I never opened up, in my locker. My locker still at the hospital I work at still is like 2/3 filled, and it's a lot of it's COVID stuff. It's just I don't want to part with it because I don't know what's going to happen. And call me insecure. That's totally fine. Some of us not, so Crocs, but there weren't enough PAPRs and not enough N95s. There were some of our staff, a very few, but some of our staff were excused from taking care of COVID patients for, health reasons, family members. I can't wear Crocs because I have bad knees. This silly stuff. By the way, since then, our hospital has said if we have a COVID surge, and we need you to take care of COVID, and you can't take care of them, then you're going to have to go. Okay, take a leave of that, but you're not. We're not going to find a job for you where you can process vents or whatever. If we can find a job, we will, but this is not going to be our standard, okay? And I will tell you, those that got excused versus those that didn't, it created tension, okay? Same day, so April 7th, manager posts his picture. So our manager at the time posts a picture of himself in scrubs, serious look on his face in front of a 980 ventilator, and had not yet stepped foot in a COVID-19 patient's room. I honestly didn't see him in the unit at all. Okay, I didn't see him, again, just didn't, so type of deal. So it is what it is, just take it at face value. February, April 8th, fellow therapist with whom I worked in the SICU the week before test positive for COVID. So, if you didn't test positive yourself, there was people around you that were testing positive for it. And sometimes it was illogical. We had an assistant manager who really didn't have a lot of COVID exposure, who also tested positive and got sick, got demonstrably sick with it. April 12th, overheard nurses talk about difficulties frontline healthcare workers having getting tested. So what I did was, it was actually something I lost some sleep over. It is, if I got sick, understand, if I even got the common cold, the presumption would be I may have COVID. Okay. One of my concerns was, and they were talking about, well, you got to fulfill this criteria. You got to have worked with COVID patients, you have fever, you got to blah, 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 blah. Then you're directed to occupational medicine, who then directs you to a website, who then talks to some guy in a dark alley. It was like, wait a minute. I want to know that I can get tested here. So I remember I talked to the same assistant manager who had gotten COVID and recovered. And all I said to her was, so-and-so, I won't say her name. She's also one of my former students, and she's a lovely woman. And I said to her, listen, I just want to know if I get sick, even if it's not COVID, can I get a hold of you and can you help me navigate to get tested as soon as possible? If you tell me yes, you've just cut my stress level by a half or a third. Okay. She assured me, and I'm like, okay, good. That's the first part. The second part is people are sweating this. They're sweating not just COVID, they're sweating the potential issue of, of basically getting sick. It may be COVID, it may not, but getting sick and then actually, having to determine whether or not it is COVID, so that you can determine whether or not you're, you can be exposed to others, or if it's just something as simple as the common cold. April 13th, lucky day, ER has COVID positive patients who are stable, not respiratory failure, coming out of the ER. It's what they did was they would have them pretty much, honestly, put a sheet over their heads, put a mask on them, and say, get out of not walk them out, just get out of the ER. But they were like running through the parking lot, like Casper the Friendly Ghost type of deal. Just being on, I was on the third floor, I'm looking out, I'm like, what was that? Is that like a toga party? I don't know. It was nothing. Again, that's a bad joke, I know. But it was just like, is this really happening? Or have I gotten COVID brain and I'm just like, I'm hallucinating? I've now realized on the 14th to 15th that I've terminally weaned or terminally extubated as many patients as I've successfully weaned and extubated. I'm talking about COVID patients, okay? I'm actually lying to you, okay? Because 8 and 8. So it really wasn't 8 that were successfully weaned and extubated. It was really kind of 7, because one of those 8 was technically COVID positive on a ventilator, but was placed on the ventilator because he needed surgery because he was a trauma patient and we're a trauma center. So his COVID finding was incidental to the reason why he was extubated. He did not have respiratory or ventilatory oxygenation, respiratory failure. So it was really, as of then, I got to correct myself. It was really, I had successfully extubated 7 that were in respiratory failure secondary to COVID, and terminally weaned 1 more than that. So it was just like, and again, weaning these patients, most of them die alone. Terrible. I'll remember this till the day I die. 42-year-old African-American father, we coded, and he basically died, removed from the ventilator. And we were, wiping down, basically from top to bottom. I was just outside the room after we had wiped it out, and they let his wife come in. She obviously full gear, and she was inconsolable. She was hysterical. And as she came down the hall, she said, "You can't let my husband die. He had just died. You can't let him die. We need him. My 2 girls and I need him." And he had passed away. He was 42 years old. And it's just, there's a lot of death and destruction, but some of them stick out in my head more than others. And that one went in my journal. April 17th, share with one of my best friends, Brian, who's a respiratory manager in the southern part of the state, that I would find myself, crying a few times a week. And I'm not one of these people that thinks that, men can't cry or whatever, but sometimes I wouldn't even know why I was crying. Usually I was alone when I was crying, in my car, in the shower. I wasn't crying in front of people. Not that I could do that, whatever. People think what they're going to think. And so I said this to him, and I said, you know what, Brian, sometimes it feels better. I cry and I feel a little better afterwards. I feel like it was like a release. And Brian says to me, he cries too, and he had a similar phenomenon. So it's not something that, we talked about a lot, but it was just sometimes this isolating thing. I was on the phone with Brian and a few of my other respiratory colleagues, talking to my respiratory colleagues I work with very often about these things. But it was amazing about how much commonality there was about what we were experiencing and feeling. Okay, and then some of the speakers that A&T uses that when we talk about COVID-19 share, kind of a similar phenomenon. And then, a nurse who I respect immensely, I would say she's kind of a toughie. I mean that in a good respect. She's got a lot of backbone, and she cries in the shower every day. more colleagues that I spoke with, the more of them say that they were just, crying or holding it back regularly. It was just something that people were doing. I will just tell you that usually I didn't really want to cry in front of my wife because she was very upset. She had just finished her radiation therapy for her breast cancer. She was, very vulnerable. She was, still on hormonal therapy. And she was emphatic. She's a nurse, but she really didn't want me at the front lines, but it was what we do. And those of you that are on, listening to this presentation now or in the recorded version of it know what I'm talking about. But moral of this slide is crying seemed like a lot of us were doing it, and it seemed like a good release. Late April, the marathon continues. So April 19th, my wife showed me 2 videos featuring hospital staff and COVID heroes. The funny thing, and I'm not a slide reader, I'm not going to read this to you. The funny thing was the people that were featured in these COVID videos were not the ones in the units. We're not working in these. They were available to be filmed. Okay. We were in the units, and we basically would have to completely, not just don and doff, change our scrubs to come out of the units. So we were in those units for 12 hours. They bought us lunch. Honestly, they bought us lunch. They actually bought in dinner. They bought in, you were well fed. Again, you were well fed, and you had plenty of footwear. Okay. You had scrubs. Usually you had scrubs. They were pretty good with that stuff. Where we changed the scrubs was in this tiny locker room. There's no place to sit down. So it really was what it was type of deal. It's crazy. But I will tell you that I made that observation. It was a little bit frustrating. Now I can look back on it and say, you know what? Sometimes people get credit for stuff they don't do. That's life. Okay. And that's going to be what it's going to be. I look back on it with just scratch my head, and you guys look around you see people getting credit for stuff they didn't do. It is what it is. April 20th, the following day, bad morning. Asked to get ready to start INO on a patient that we were supinating. We were turned from a prone to a supine position. Went upstairs, INO event supply. There were 2 RTs there who were excused from direct patient care, who, I don't know, they seemed like they're otherwise healthy, but I don't know, whatever. I at the time I was 61 years old. I could have actually, I could have said I'm old, now I'm 63. I feel like, physically I feel good, but emotionally, I probably feel like I'm 68 or 70, something along those lines. I don't know. They were excused, and I basically said I need to set up this nitrate. I understand you guys were setting up ready bags with all of the fittings and everything like that. I need to get this stuff back down. And they're like, and I'm like, I find myself, I got myself frustrated. I didn't like curse at them or anything like that, but I was just like, I was very clipped with them, and I'm like, all right, I'll get it. I'll do this. But I'm thinking to myself, what if these people are not taking care of COVIDs? They're not helping us with equipment. What are they doing? We're not doing PFTs because they were both PFT members. What are they doing? Why are they here? Okay. I could use a runner. I'll tell you, they would make a really good runner, but they were excused from being in the units, not even in the rooms. So it was just like, WTF. It is what it is. You scratch your head, you get frustrated, you get over it, you move on with your life. Dear journal, it went in the journal. No more bouffant caps. I swear I did this. I was the idiot running around the unit, not literally running. I was walking around the unit. I took a shoe guard. I kind of, my wife tells me I kind of have a big head. I don't have a lot of hair on my head, but I have a big head. A shoe guard will fit on your head. Okay, so shoe guards you put when you go down to the OR, whatever the case may be, it didn't fit well. I felt like I had a little circulation issue there going on. So I may have a little bit of COVID brain, not so much because of COVID, but because I a little too tight around the head thing. But I worked a 12-hour shift. I had a shoe guard that was on my head because there was no more bouffant caps. And then I started hoarding them. People were hoarding toilet paper. I hoarded bouffant caps and, a few other things. Late April, endless. Okay, like we were experiencing. So, some of us starting to wonder, if we had COVID and didn't know it. I had a cold in February before this all started, and it wasn't bad. It was just it was a nagging 3-4 week cold. Usually I get a cold 5 days, 7 days, I'm over it. This one, it went on. And I wasn't like deathly ill. And it was it undulated. I would feel kind of almost on the verge of being, I don't really feel so good. Then I'd feel better. Then 2 days later, I'd feel kind of crappy again. So I was thinking, did I have COVID? I was swab sampled a little over a year ago, and they said, you don't have antibodies. You probably weren't exposed. I don't know. A lot of jury rigging going on. You're using servo filters on, 840 ventilators. Just a lot of jury rigging going on. I mentioned in one of the parallel presentations, pregnant women, the evidence does suggest this may be the case. They may recover more robustly as a group, not each individual pregnant woman, than non-pregnant women. Okay. It's something just to kind of keep your ear to the tracks on. We observed anecdotally, and this has also been supported by some of the evidence, obese men or males, especially Latinos, seem to have a higher predilection. They seem to be more vulnerable to this disease. Okay. We wondered at times, we're doing the jury rigging, risk management issues. I don't know. We did what we had to do. We had, we had providing compassionate and good care to patients was in the forefront. So the jury rigging wasn't to be lazy. It was, we were trying to make do. Let April end. April 22nd, 17 bench running in 22 bed ICU, 2 nitrics, proning. It was just crazy. And it was myself and a loner therapist who was a PFT therapist at a different site. She was a workhorse, meaning she worked hard, but she had no passwords to get in, to pull drugs, to get into the computer system, to get type of deal. Okay. So it was just like, she and I, we did what we had to do. We did what we had to do, but it was probably one of the busiest days I've ever had as a respiratory therapist. Didn't stop. Bed 18. So I basically said to her, you probably should have a PAPR hood, because I could be in one of these rooms assisting with a bedside trach. I can't come out of the room, and you could be a code, and you got to go in the room, and you should have a PAPR. And I told her, okay. I'm going to circle back to that issue pretty soon. The following day, bed 18 almost died. Actually did die a week later, but probably did. We supinated him. So we went from prone positioning to supine. His SATs dropped to 40. We took a blood gas off of the A line, and his PO2 was 21. Dr. M and Dr. S, those are real first initials, were in the room with me, and we're fiddling around. One of the doctors was like, well, let's elevate this lung. And I looked down and says, listen, we need to reverse what we just did. We need to reprone him. We need to do it now. So whereas we had a proning team and all this other stuff, the 3 of us just flipped them. I secured the airway. I had the head of the bed, secured the airway. We lifted the shoulders. They did their thing. We flipped the patient back. And it was a shit show for, the next hour and 15 minutes we were in the room as well. That same day, I had a few words with the doctor who was doing a peg insertion. So coming out of this room, I'm like sweating, just kind of sweat through my scrubs, whatever. And he just grabbed the PAPR that I had just repaired. And he came in and he just took a PAPR. And like, is this anybody's PAPR? And I was like, whoa, dude. And we got protocol here. I says, if you're going to take your PAPR, I says, I know this is my PAPR, meaning the one because I just put pink tape. I repaired the hose with pink tape myself. It's my patch job. Okay. So, and he didn't know what to do. He was just like, I said, listen, the moral of the story is this: you go do what you got to do. When you come here, you ask to use. You don't just grab a PAPR. Okay, because some of us may be running. You're doing elective procedure that needs to be done. We may be going to do an emergent one. We need to account for all of these things. And I swear, I think he had to change his underwear. It was the Wild West. There was a lot of frustration and anger that was going on in these units. We worked together nicely, but there was a few times when stuff like that actually happened. Doctor came up to me later and he's apologized, and I apologized to him. I said, listen, I was hard on you. I was too hard on you. Whatever. I'm sorry. I'm not perfect, but just keep it in mind for future. And that was that. We were in pretty good shape as far as that goes. We went on with our lives. Confrontation, frustration, reflection, lions and tigers and bears on my. It was just what it was. Our team manager questions me about what had happened. My recommending to the loner RT that we had that she basically get a PAPR hood. And he didn't come into the unit. He got the assistant manager to call me out of the unit and basically said, did you say to so-and-so that she needs a PAPR hood? I said, yeah, I think so. You're talking about something happened a week ago? I said, I think so. And then he indicated that an N95 is good as a PAPR. I basically said, if it is, then we're going to be supinating a patient in bed 18. You want to, come. We could use your help. He's another one. He's another basically morbidly obese individual. Bigger issue, and I'm not going to read these words. What I actually did was I looked him in the eyes and I said, so-and-so, I haven't seen you for about 3 weeks. I understand you were sick. Are you okay? And I'm not trying to pry. And he goes, I didn't have COVID, but I was sick. I'm like, well, we're glad that you're back. Okay. But in my view, I haven't seen you in 3 weeks. The first words out of your mouth when you saw me as the lead therapist for the adult ICU should have been, thank you, thank your team, and what can I do for you? And I looked at him and said, you failed that test. Okay. And P.S., you should have a greater presence in these units. You're our leader. Behave like one. Those words came out of my mouth. It was what it was. And then, you know, I think he had to change his underwear too. So it was another one of those. I did remind him also, you know, I said, the other thing I want to mention is that I had a loner RT that day, and I explained how heavy the assignment was. Okay. She was good. It wasn't her. She was fine. Okay. But she couldn't be as productive as one of our homegrown therapists because she didn't have all the passwords. She didn't have. And I said, he goes, well, you know, Al, some of our therapists are excused from taking care of patients because of their age, because they have, you know, conditions, because they have family members. And I looked at him and I says, please stop. I says, my wife literally, praise the Lord, there's a God up there, because my wife finished her radiation therapy like 10 days before COVID started to rear its ugly head. Okay. Somehow it was a effing miracle that she got all of her radiation in. But I said, do understand something. She's immunocompromised right now. Okay. She has a disease, you know, she has cancer. She had a lumpectomy recently, and she's had radiation. Okay. She may be a candidate for chemotherapy as well. Okay. So I could have had an excuse to get out, and I chose not to. And looking back, I would have made that same decision again. However, and he started saying, well, how is she doing? I'm like, don't. And he never harassed me again. It's just one of those things. It was like, I don't know, you can't make this stuff up. But early May, you know, we had the light at the end of the tunnel. Number of cases is starting to slow. So, you know, just FYI, there was this delay where if you're from like southern states, you guys peaked after we did. We pretty much peaked in like late April. So we weren't over the hump here, but number of new cases is slowing. You know, we now have about 60 COVID events from a high of about 99. So we still have a lot. The PICU is back. So the pediatric intensive care is back to being a PICU. Hallelujah. Okay. May 5th, I had a long conversation with my brother, and I basically, you know, just talking, I was venting, but just going on and on. And I indicated to him that if you get a bad case of COVID, which results in hypoxemia, 50% chance you're going to die. And then I basically said, Laurel knows when in case something happens to Laurel, I do not want to be intubated if this happens to me. I don't want it. Do not want it. I don't care. So the critical issues are, you know, and I missed my family. I still do, because we're still doing like some element of isolation with the latest variant. So now we're early May. You know, did I speak too soon? Ironic, population urged to practice social distancing. So the general population socially distanced, and we're like a foot away from the sickest of sick patients, secretions flying all over the place, assisting with an intubation, all kinds of crazy stuff going on there. So it was just this irony. Hey, everybody social distance, unless you're taking care of these patients, then we want you in there. We want you knee deep in gore, knee deep in COVID-ridden secretions. Okay. And it was just like, just crazy stuff when you see that. And I'm all about social distancing, just so we're clear on that. But you're just kind of the dichotomy between being in the front lines, like many of you, and just kind of being in the periphery. And I think that if a lot of people saw what we saw, their opinions on social distancing and vaccination would be somewhat different. Deliberately skipping down here in the interest of time. Anesthesiologist Dr. L says to me, COVID owns me. And my rebuttal to him, I was assisting him with an intubation, is that COVID owns us all right now, dude. I definitely spoke too soon. May 15:30, 13 hours of stress. So it was one of those things where if I was being crude, I would say, coming into my mind, what I'll say is this. I believe that a week or two before this, my eyelids started twitching. One of those twitches that you kind of can't see, but you can feel. And it didn't stop for a very long time. So it was like one of these 13 hours of stress, ear, nose, throat doctor. We were tracheing a patient. And when I was he was inserting the tracheostomy, I was pulling the tube out, and basically we lost end tidal. He found a false track. It was a very difficult trach. Okay. And bottom line is, a bunch of us were in the room for about an hour and a half. And what we ended up doing was we ended up re-intubating the patient. The patient had like a 7.5 with a 6.5. The glottis with a bronchoscope, we could visualize the glottis, which was like a crescent moon shape. It was thin. It was like this tiny, totally misshapen glottis. Okay. So I remember one of the intensivists is saying, all right, the 6.5, it's not going through there. And I'm basically saying, take the stylet. I literally took his hand and kind of gently but firmly helped him advance the tube through the glottis, 6.5, but we now had an airway back. Praise the Lord. By the way, this woman ended up surviving. She ended up surviving. It's one of those things. And this is where I'm saying my eyelids started twitching at about this time and it didn't stop. I think 5 weeks, it could have even been longer than 5 weeks. Just wouldn't stop. Breathing room, Memorial Day weekend. This is not this past, but the one before. It's the first time that I was in a clean unit in about 10 or 11 weeks. Felt weird. It just felt weird. You kept thinking, waiting for the other shoe to drop, thinking if you got one patient's room, you got to die. You still had to be careful with infection control, but it was nothing like. Intubated my first non-COVID patient in about 3 months because we do a lot of respiratory, there's a lot of intubations at the hospital I work at. Actually, a small amount of downtime, just couldn't, it's just like I could actually read my hospital email and, didn't have to be totally skeeved out. And I got home sooner because I didn't have to go through my ritual of changing my socks, wiping myself down, changing my scarf, didn't have to do all that. So actually, it was a Saturday, and that weekend, and I could get home at, 8 o'clock instead of 8:30 or 8:45 after a 13-hour shift. Reflection and debriefing. So what I'm going to say about this particular sucks, I know we're kind of running down here on time, is that, I attend what's called the ICU committee meeting, and it was observed that some very supportive statements that were made for respiratory in this particular meeting. And one of the points was there was very few, if any, unplanned extubations. We were proning all these patients. And the MICU medical director basically said, well, they were all heavily sedated with RASs of -3, so Richmond agitation scores of -3, -4. So of course they're not going to have unplanned extubations. I'm thinking to myself, unplanned extubations aren't just self-extubations, okay? They are sometimes positioning issues where, where they roll a patient, the tube stay, they roll the tube stave and then self-extubated, okay? Or some other phenomenon, you're proning a patient, whatever the case may be. So it's really like, he had to get his 2 cents in about, a guy who barely stepped foot in a patient's room, okay, had to get his 2 cents in about, well, it really wasn't as big a deal as that. We weren't looking to be a big deal. It was just, we all worked, we were proud of it, okay? And it was something that basically should have been acknowledged. Our leadership team came up with these playbooks. The funny thing is they came up with the playbooks and they didn't consult us. So it was COVID-19 playbooks of what to do and how to do it. And the first time I saw it, I was like, where did these come from? And they basically look like policy and procedure manuals. I think somebody told them you need to come up with playbooks. So we can say we have playbooks, but you're not going to involve the people who are doing the care in creating the playbooks. It was a failure of leadership, abjectly, period, done, sealed. I'm not saying our leadership team failed in every way. They really were quite strong in a lot of ways, but in some ways it was just something to see. You couldn't make it up. I could go on, but it was just a lot of interesting things that were uncovered, if you will, in the ensuing months after the initial surge. So what we did is we actually created a survey for our department. Because we were not included in the system-wide. Respiratory was not even mentioned, meaning you had to say, when you did this organizational survey, you had to say what was your discipline, except you couldn't choose respiratory because it wasn't a choice. You had to choose other. So it was like, how are you going to find out how we felt? So we did our own departmental survey, March through June, and these are some excerpts. And indeed, we tried to make it, just FYI, for those of you, any of you who were vaguely interested in doing survey research, Dillman, with a D, Dillman has written a textbook on survey research, which is analogous to, Dillman is the survey research that Egan's Fundamentals, our cornerstone textbook, is to respiratory care. So we tried to follow best practices in coming up with this, and we got some very interesting feedback, some of which our management team responded to. Good news, bad news. So some of it, just winding down this presentation. Good news is the department has acquired more ventilators. We plan to flex personnel amongst sites, contingency plans such as use of runners, etc. The bad news is N95s are still hard to get. Again, vaccine. What I mentioned earlier is the vaccine survey was done, didn't even mention us. It was just one of those things. Not a false sense of security with these playbooks. I'm not saying the playbooks are worthless, but it was just, don't you think you'd want to involve those that are actually doing, that are running the plays? Okay, think about it, running the plays. Some protocols are inefficient. Some protocols are dictated by the availability of resources, not what's clinically best. Winter 2021, so really looking at regionally, rise in severe cases, so an increase, it blipped up. better job. We did a better job with palliation. So I think we never got above 18 or 19 COVID events because we were doing better job with, okay, this is as far as we're going to go, or, talking to family, engaging them more aggressively in palliation meetings, things along those lines. They would de-escalate patients at 28 days, so they would actually transfer them to clean units. So there's a lot of that was going on. Bad N95 is still short. Testing is still hard to get. Sometimes inaccurate. Vaccine rollout was bumpy at first. There were some that were excused from patient care that got the vaccine before frontliners. Okay. Other things, false sense of security, the X-ray machines that went into the rooms, dialysis machines, they would wipe them down, but come on, it's an X-ray machine with wheels and stuff like that. Post-traumatic stress, it's something that our other speakers have actually talked to. It's really, is it yet to fulminate? I'm sure that I have it. I'm certain that I have it. And I'm just grateful that I'm able to function pretty well and talk about it pretty openly. I think I should thank you again because maybe sharing it in a session like this is as helpful to me as it is to maybe to some of you. February 20th, Chief Medical Officer compares data from different hospitals. So he was comparing, the point of it is it was a little bit like a apples to oranges comparison. So he's comparing data from hospitals within our system which used high flow and didn't. However, there was different staffing levels at those hospitals. There was a lot of other variables that I was unclear as to whether or not they were controlled for. If he was truly doing a apples to apples comparison. That's really what this is talking about. It's not to be judgmental or anything. I think he's a bright man. He really did a lot of good stuff during COVID and stuff like that. I just was a little bit unsure when I listened to it as to whether or not that that it was truly an apples to apples comparison, and that our hospital was indeed had better outcomes than some of our sister hospitals. So some of the positives, spring, summer of 2021, which kind of here we are now. Our hospital finally introduced an ensemble of emotional support things that are in place. That's to really they are to be commended for that. New long hauler support system. So it's not just for COVID. There's a subset of for COVID. So those individuals that have long hauler syndrome, so post ICU syndrome, but particularly the COVID-19s, those individuals, we've actually created, if you will, a group where we have a physician, a couple of nurses, and these individuals, social worker, and they get together routinely. It's kind of ironic. We have one of our nurse managers got basically best COVID nurse for our institution, and honestly, she was very present. God bless her, very, very present. But she never stepped. She never stepped foot in a patient's room. It was just whatever. The Delta variant is troubling as we speak, so a lot of uncertainty there of ticking cases. It seems to be much more contagious. Whether or not it's virulent or not, as virulent, more virulent is still unclear at this stage of the game. So another thing, one of our RTs who was not vaccinated, her husband recently contracted COVID, twice presented to our emergency room, only to be sent home without much of anything. Ended up going to a Medi center, got prescribed steroids, and gave him relief that day. He said he felt better. Maybe it was just a coincidence, but he said he felt notably better, which, by the way, has also been reported by others. Many of us who serve the front lines indicate that we're forever altered, and that is what it is. I think I'm preaching to the choir on that as well. What we've learned, we have these clinical issues. ARDSNet strategies didn't work. I'm just going to kind of read a few of these, not all of them. Healthcare resources were overwhelmed, in probably the most resource-rich country in the world. Expose both strengths and weaknesses with the leadership team, both locally, within the organization, as well as nationally and beyond. Good leaders possess these innate skills, able to lead despite a changing environment. And individuals who became leaders, maybe for some of the, I don't say wrong reasons, but the internal, the vanity, the pay, the title, the prestige, that sort of thing, and didn't necessarily have a true leadership acumen. It became glaringly apparent, okay? Those that were in leadership roles that were over their head became readily apparent. There were people in high-level positions we didn't see for months. They were working from home. I don't know what they were doing. I don't know, that's all. So it is what it is. So we also have the societal response, which will forever altered as well. More work to be done, overlapping roles, responsibilities of government, adopting effective clinical protocols, individual rights versus protecting society. So that people that don't get vaccinated, do they have a societal if you will, a calling to society, or do they have, a duty to society in order to not get inoculated for themselves, but get the vaccine to protect others? Ensuring proper and realistic infection control, balancing economic impact and safety, constantly a constant challenge. Post-traumatic stress for frontliners and the other indicators that I list here as well. Selected references here. I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to thank you for indulging me, because as I said, this presentation was as helpful to me as I hope it's been to some of you. Thank you very much. Hopefully you'll come to us again and have a wonderful day.